are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies, discussing this all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?
Good afternoon and welcome back to everybody in the room and to people joining us online. My name is Joanna Roberts. I'm Senior EU Policy Editor at Politico, and I'm joined on stage by one of our sustainability reporters, Leonie Keita. Now, before the break, we heard our panellists talk about the EU's bioeconomy strategy and got a taste of some of the tensions around using biomass or trees for energy production. We're going to turn our attention away from the forests and towards the oceans now. So, Leonie, you're going to be moderating the next panel where we'll be diving into the Ocean Pact and whether the EU can actually deliver on its ambitions there. Tell us why this matters so much, why it's so important, and what you're hoping to hear.
Well, this year has actually been a big one for the world's oceans. We've had, like you said, the arrival of the EU Ocean Pact, which announced an EU Ocean Pact coming next year. And we also have a new global treaty to protect the high seas, the international waters. And so those are a few of the topics that we'll be diving into today. So, yeah, I'm very excited.
Great. Well, I'll let you get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Joanna. So on top of generating more than half the planet's oxygen, the ocean also absorbs 30% of all carbon dioxide emissions. But with marine and coastal ecosystems facing multiple threats, from climate change to overfishing and pollution, that could all change. Ocean oxygen content is already decreasing globally. That's why world leaders earlier this year ratified a global binding agreement to help protect the world's oceans and international waters. And it's also why the European Commission has promised to come up with an EU Ocean Act by 2027. Joining us today to discuss all this and more, we have EU Commissioner for Oceans and Fisheries, Kostas Kadis, and Irish Minister of State for the Department of Agriculture, Food, Fisheries and the Marine, Timmy Dooley. Thank you to you both and welcome. So, Commissioner Kadis, according to the European Environment Agency, the EU is unlikely to hit the EU biodiversity strategy target of protecting at least 30% of EU seas by 2030. How will the EU Ocean Act get the EU back on course? And how will you ensure that this incoming proposal has teeth?
Yeah. The important thing with the Ocean Act is that it will set the legal framework for ocean governance, and it will place all ocean-related targets under one single roof. This way, it will promote coherence and coordination among different policies. The Ocean Act will build on the revision of the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which is a directive that promotes cross-sectoral coordination in terms of locating different activities in the maritime space. And at the same time, it will take into consideration the revision of the Marine Spatial Planning Directive, which includes the environmental targets. And most possibly, these two directives, with their revision, will be unified and will form the European Ocean Act. So the new dimension of our policy is coordination among different policies that aim at the preservation and sustainable management of the marine environment under the European Ocean Act. It is very important that the Ocean Act has been included in the work program of the European Commission, and it will be developed in 2026 following an extensive consultation exercise that will take into consideration the views of all affected stakeholders. It will be an open and very transparent procedure.
And the annex of the European Ocean Pact and announced the Ocean Act reiterates an aspirational goal of phasing out bottom trawling in marine protected areas by 2030, as previously announced in a 2023 EU Marine Action Plan. Can we expect the Ocean Act to follow through on this? And if so, how?
Well, the bottom trawling takes place in a wide range of situations and the impact on marine environment in different areas ranges a lot from an area to another. Therefore, the European Commission is in favor of the science-based targeted approach which takes into consideration the actual situation in every marine protected area. We say that, for example, bottom trawling cannot exist where we protect a species or a habitat that is in the seabed, on the seabed. So the bottom trawling can take place where this is compatible with what we want to protect. So we are not in favor of the one-size-fits-all. We are in favor of an approach that takes into consideration the scientific advice, the scientific opinion, and it is, I believe that it is balanced. However, I believe that the European legislation, as it is now, is very robust, and what we need is to focus on the implementation and reaching the targets, the existing targets of the legislation. If we reach the existing targets and through the Ocean Act, we will facilitate our efforts towards these targets, I believe that we will contribute substantially to the preservation of our marine environment.
And Minister, from the perspective of a maritime country like Ireland, which will also hold the EU Council presidency the second half of next year, what do you think the EU Ocean Act should aim to accomplish, and how, as the Commissioner said, could it help countries implement existing EU governance laws?
Yeah, I think the most important aspect of a presidency is the capacity of the holder to work with member states. No one can ultimately dictate what the trajectory should be. So it's about working with member states, but first of all having a comprehensive legal basis to implement the policy, and that the Ocean Act will provide that. Just kind of maybe pulling back a little bit from that, I noticed when Commissioner and I were down in Nice last year for the UN Ocean Conference, the level of engagement from member states in the first instance, and how well that was, I think, welcomed by all. You had President Macron and indeed President von der Leyen together with heads of state right across Europe, but also much wider afield. A recognition at this stage that we have to act, that the state of our oceans is in a perilous state. And I think for me, that was the strength of the desire to do things differently, that we can't keep taking from the ocean in the way that we have, that we must bring a coherence to its management through sustainable fishing, through marine protected areas, through the management of the spatial squeeze that exists when we're trying to get renewable energy. All of that together requires, I think, a very clear legal framework, which the Ocean Act will bring into play. And I just think then obviously that has to have an architecture that assists those who find it difficult to adhere to it in the first instance. But it's about working together. It's about around that shared and common goal. And the Commissioner has shown a great willingness and a great capacity to work with member states and countries on a broader level to bring that understanding. And we've got to understand where some countries are coming from, the difficulties that they face in making that jump. But I think what we've got to do, and I mean, even a conversation like today is really important. And I'm often taken by some who seem to suggest that, is it conservation or is it exploitation? Is it commercialism or is it safeguarding? You can't have one without the other. You certainly can't have a commercial activity in the ocean unless you manage it appropriately and carefully. And I think there's a willingness now, generally, not always with everybody, but generally, to move in that direction. And I think that's what we will be, as part of our presidency, providing that soft, active and resilient encouragement to meet the targets that we've set out. And I can only look at it in the context of my own country, the one I know best, in terms of what we have to do in the next number of years, even in terms of marine protected areas, to get to the 2030 and to get to 30%, which is challenging for a small country like us, where we have 7 times more sea than we have land. But yet, it's critically important for the challenges that we face, but also the opportunities that we see, particularly in the transition to a green environment, the decarbonisation of our energy mix, and embracing the offshore renewables, which is something that 10 years ago would have been a sort of a pipe dream.
And how, I understand that the Irish government has approved the preparation of revising the Maritime Area Planning Act.
Yes.
And that will provide the legislative basis for new protected areas. Can you give an indication of how the bill would ensure that marine protected areas are protected in practice to avoid the coming up of paper parks, as people say?
So right from the start, we took the view that it's not just about designating an area. It's also about having a management plan and an audit trail of the areas that you protect. And as the Commissioner has said, it's not always about a one-size-fits-all. It's about understanding what it is you're seeking to protect in that particular zone. So it's not an exclusive get out of there. It's to end that which is destroying that of which you want to protect. So we've taken a slightly different approach to the previous government in terms of the legal mechanism that is put in place. Back in 2021, we brought in the Marine Spatial Planning Act. And that set out a very clear legislative basis for development at sea, principally around the offshore renewable opportunity. And a tool within that is what we refer to as a DMAP, or a designation of a marine area, designating a marine area plan, identifying an area in which you can do something, whether it be renewable energy, whether it be some other activity or whatever. We deployed that 2 years ago to identify our first offshore renewable area suitable plan. It went very well. We had little objections. It was all about engagement with stakeholders, fishermen and women, with coastal communities, etc. And we got the designation done. We then said, when I took office with advisors, we looked at how can we move more quickly now to designate our marine protected areas. And we felt that the mechanism that we had in the Marine Planning Act provided us with exactly that tool. So if you deploy the mechanism to identify an area suitable for offshore renewables, why not use the same engagement process, the same engagement with stakeholders, to identify an area suitable for marine protection, that which we protected. So we've effectively taken that decision at government. We're now making the necessary amendments to the existing Act. And why I was so anxious to do that, because I can do it more quickly. If I was to go back and try and bring an entirely separate piece of legislation, to me it was creating a third leg of our planning stool, which didn't make sense. Go with what was tried and trusted, and allow us to get to that holy grail of 30 by 2030. At the moment, we have about 9% of our areas protected, and that's through special areas of conservation and SPAs under the Natura 2000 area, the Habitats Directive, which we're utilising for that. So to get beyond that, we need a tried and trusted method. So I'm very confident, and very much part of getting to this point was engagement with the NGOs, whose opinion I value greatly, and whom I know have the best interests of our oceans at heart. So I've engaged with them, and they're broadly accepting of the approach. Now we've got to get the work done, and we will progress with that.
And from the EU-Ocean Act, can we expect further EU guidance or laws to help other countries establish marine protected areas and make sure that there is some kind of framework in place? It sounds like there's no plans to phase out bottom trawling by 2030 as such, but is that something that the Commission is looking into?
Yeah, we are collecting success stories across the European Union. I've visited many countries and I've seen on the ground how management of marine protected areas is carried out. And I have to say that the most interesting examples are those where different stakeholders come together for the designation and the management of marine protected areas. For example, the fishers themselves are involved in the marine protection. And they are working along with NGOs and with the local civil society and the local governments and the national governments, and they have the support of all the stakeholders. So this kind of cooperation, I think that it is much more acceptable to the stakeholders and brings more effective and positive results. And as a conservation biologist, I know very well that conservation measures are much more effective when they are implemented with the consensus, and even better with the support of the local stakeholders. So what we are going to do is to collect this kind of best examples, success stories, and we will showcase them to all over the European Union as good examples to be followed by all member states. So it will be like a guide for marine protected areas.
Okay, interesting. So no binding laws or rules, but having a kind of a playbook to follow.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. And then I also wanted to zoom out to the UN High Seas Treaty, which is due to enter into force next month, and will pave the way for new marine protected areas being established in international waters and determine how they should be managed. Commissioner Cadis, there's a push from several EU countries against the European Commission's proposal to encase the High Seas Treaty in EU law, and they see the Commission as overstepping international competences. I wonder, what's your response to EU governments that are pushing against this proposal from the Commission?
Firstly, let me stress that the ratification of the BBNJ agreement was a great achievement for which the European Commission has a catalytic role. And now we are working for its proper and effective implementation. In this direction, we have prepared, you're right, we have prepared a directive. This directive raised some concerns by member states. However, the Danish presidency submitted a revised proposal trying to address these concerns. This proposal was discussed at the European Parliament and secured the endorsement of the Parliament, and now it is discussed at the Council level. I feel that since most of the concerns have been addressed, I feel that we are very close to the approval of the directive, and we will work in a very focused way for its proper implementation. What we aim with this directive is the unified and effective implementation of the High Seas Treaty. But the European Union is not limited to the European level. We are trying to support the implementation of the High Seas Treaty internationally. We have already pledged 40 million euro for supporting developing countries in the proper implementation of the BBNJ agreement. And along with Seychelles and Palau, we have relaunched the High Ambition Coalition in order to promote again the effective implementation of the BBNJ agreement worldwide.
Okay. And Minister, do you have a stance on the High Seas Treaty, or the Commission's proposal to encase the High Seas Treaty?
Yeah, well, we have signed and ratified right from the start, and we see the significance and importance of it, because there's little point in member states working on the areas within their own jurisdiction when you consider the scale of the seas beyond which I think there's probably 2/3 of our oceans are beyond national jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. It's half the surface of the earth. So if we're not serious about protecting that, why would we bother protecting our own? So for me, it is vitally important that we put in place an agreement. And again, we have to do it through cooperation. And there are times those with a different viewpoint, we have to work with them. We have to bring them to the table. But certainly, again, sort of referring back to that UN Ocean Conference in Nice, there was from right across the globe. And I think when you look particularly at the small islands and you see the impact that climate change is having there, and the impacts of the way in which we utilise the oceans and the way we manage them, and the impact that it's having on those, it's imperative that we get this right and that we work collectively to bring it about. And as I said, we've been at the forefront of this, and we will use our presidency to progress the work in concert with and consultation with the Commission through that.
And so you're both confident that the Commission's proposal will make it through by the entry into force of the treaty?
Yeah, look, there's going to be challenges. It's the case with every European directive, with every initiative that you take when you're trying to bring people with and countries with diverse obligations, diverse on occasion requirements, who have different views and ideas, demands, whether they be economic or whatever. You're going to have to work through, but you know that's why we exist. That's the nature of what we're involved in politics and public life for.
Mm-hmm. And last question before we bring in our other panelists. Another hot topic is that of deep sea mining. And this past year, we've seen an unprecedented push to fire the starting gun on mining in the deep sea. Amid the EU's continuing push for critical raw materials, can you, Commissioner, guarantee that the Commission will stick by its position on a precautionary pause for deep sea mining in the years to come?
Yes, I can confirm that the position of the European Commission is in favor of the precautionary pause. Okay. And this was very clearly stated in the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030, but also the European Ocean Pact. Therefore, we feel that we need first to fill the knowledge gaps and make sure, demonstrate that no destruction of the marine environment will be the result of this kind of activities before we start these activities. This is the position of the European Union, of the European Commission. That was, as I mentioned earlier, it was confirmed with the European Ocean Pact.
And with the Trump administration preparing to forge ahead with deep-sea mining approvals, how should countries engaged in the International Seabed Authority talks respond? Yeah, different member states may have different views, and that's why the position that I described before was not approved at the Council level. Therefore, we cannot force the member states to have the same position as the European Commission, and it is the competence of each member state to express
their activities as they wish.
Okay, and then would you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Commissioner has set out the situation. Every member state has a representative of the International Seabed Authority. The approach of Ireland is very much a precautionary one. It's about having the scientific advice. It's about having the best data available. And until such is the case, we certainly would want a pause on any activity. It's a bit more challenging than if it was just the competence of the Union. But nonetheless, it's important that no more than anything that we've talked about earlier, or I presume for the rest of the afternoon, it's about a science-led approach. It's about accepting the facts that the scientists provide, and then, until you have that, let's not try to further erode or degrade or impact on our oceans for all the reasons that we have already addressed.
Thank you very much. We'll now open up this discussion to a broader panel and invite 2 more speakers. So with us we have Anaïs, we'll have joining us now. We have Anaïs Berthier, Senior Lawyer and Head of Client Earth Brussels, and Espen Sverdrup Jensen, President of the European Association of Fish Producers Organizations. So let's dive a bit more into the Ocean Act, and we'll also talk a bit about the upcoming Environmental Omnibus. Anaïs, the Client Earth has been active in taking legal action against several governments on bottom trawling in marine protected areas. What are your first reactions, the responses from Commissioner Cadis and Minister Dooley, particularly on the Ocean Act and MPAs?
Sure. Thanks. Well, first, in relation to the EU Ocean Act, we think it should consolidate on international and EU commitments and really take into account all the activities that are taking place in the ocean. So whether it is fisheries, we haven't heard too much about fisheries, energy, shipping, tourism, and their cumulative impact, but to also include in the Act the target in the Global Biodiversity Framework, in the EU Biodiversity Strategy, designate 30% of the seas as marine protected areas and 10% as strictly protected. And when we mean protected, it should mean protected. And unfortunately, that is not the case yet. And so the main issue we have today, we think, is that clearly it is the lack of implementation and enforcement of EU environmental law, including the Habitats and the Birds Directive, despite the fact that Ms. von der Leyen has committed to improve implementation and enforcement, including through infringement proceedings, despite the fact that the European Commission actually estimates the cost of the lack of implementation of EU environmental law to around, and I think it's at least 180 billion euros a year for the EU's economy. And the impact of this lack of implementation and enforcement of EU environmental law is that we see bottom trawling taking place in marine protected areas today. And it's not an isolated issue, it's a widespread failure across Europe. And despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of EU citizens are actually in favor of real protection in marine protected areas and expect national governments and the European Commission to take action. And so it's not clear. And he asked whether the European Ocean Act is going to have teeth. Well, it's not clear because we don't see any plan in relation to improving implementation and enforcement. And so that's really worrying because that European Commission is the European Commission that has opened the lowest number of infringement proceedings throughout the last 2 decades. According to our number, DG Mare would have opened only 1 infringement case in 2024 within its remit. So why isn't that happening? Why is the European Commission not enforcing EU environmental law? To us, that is also the priority, because you can adopt any laws you want. If they are not correctly implemented and enforced on the ground, we will not deliver, and marine protected areas will remain paper parks, protected only in name.
And Commissioner, would you like to respond to Anaïs on particular infringements?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the European legal framework is very robust. We have the the habitats and the birds directives. We have the nature restoration law. And if we implement correctly these directives, I think that we can secure the effective protection and best management of our marine protected areas. For example, the Habitats Directive provides for each protected area a management plan to be developed, which will be scientifically sound, and we will describe which activities can take place in the marine protected area, activities that are compatible with the habitat or the species that we want to protect. Therefore, it's up to the member states to implement correctly the legal framework. You are right that the European Union can do, the European Commission can do more about enforcement and about compliance. And I assure you that this will be our focus in the coming period.
I'd like to bring in Espen now. What do you make of what we've heard so far, and what do you think needs to be prioritized in the Ocean Act?
I very much agree with what you're saying, that a lot of the protection is in name only and not in reality. And a lot of member states have been slow in implementing these directives. I think the pace is up. If I look around the member states that I know, that we're moving from what we call skin protection to something real. Tomorrow, we in Denmark, where I come from, together the fishing industry collectively, together with the wind and a bunch of NGOs, hunting associations, will put forward a set of recommendations for the 30 by 30 protection. So basically guidelines for how to identify protected areas, the 20% with protection and the 10% with a high level of protection. And that's a very good example of what was mentioned by the Commissioner and by the Minister of Stakeholders coming together and setting, working on joint recommendations for how to implement this. So this is basically a set of guidelines for the Danish government to work on, based on the Convention of Biodiversity and all of these principles. So a fairly ambitious, or very ambitious, I would say, set of guidelines, first of all, to set pace on this exercise, but also to help governments navigate in this exercise. And I hear that similar exercises are being done in Ireland and in other countries, where you bring the stakeholders on board, including the fishing industry. And this is absolutely necessary. And a key element in these recommendations is the identification of, let's say, areas where fishing should be allowed. So basically production zones. And that addresses one of the key issues also related to the Ocean Act, is that what the fishing industry really needs is some kind of stability in our access to the resources. If we're going to renew the European fishing fleet, if we're going to bring the next generation of fishermen and women into the sector, we need some kind of stability in terms of our the way that we can develop the sector, how we can modernize the sector. So economic stability is absolutely key, and that follows with environmental protection. We're not against environmental protection, not at all. We live from the sea. We need a protective marine environment, but we also need to know where we can fish and where we can generate the income that's necessary to bring the sector forward. And that's why it's so important for everyone to be part of this. And we've done this in Denmark, and I think there's a lot of progress, similar progress, coming from other member states.
And as a representative of an EU government, can you point to why it can be so hard for EU countries, it seems, to implement EU law on ocean conservation, for example? Do you need more? Is it a question of funding? Is it a question of harmonizing? What's the issue here?
No, I don't think so. I think the legislative tools are there. I think there's a recognition by most member states that the direction of travel has to change. There certainly is by the fishermen and women that I deal with and have the pleasure to work with. a recognition that if there's to be a future, and you talked about it, it's about certainty. It's about knowing that there's going to be a supply of fish into the future, and that if they make an investment, that they'll be able to pay off their debts, and they'll be able to live in harmony in their coastal communities, and they'll be able to provide employment. But, you know, it seems almost a sort of a simplistic comment, but they can't do that unless there's fish. And fishermen and the industry that I have the pleasure of working with clearly know that. And they know now, because the biomass of so many important species are under enormous threat. And Commissioner and I, and I'm sure you through your Minister and your representatives, will be in a less bright room, I suspect, this time next week or later on in the week, trying to figure out where we go for 2026 in terms of the fishing opportunities that exist. And the scientific advice is very, very blunt, it's very direct, and it paints a rather grim picture of where the biomass is at. I think that has put shockwaves through governments. I think the industry could see it coming perhaps maybe before some governments, and it's a challenge to all of us that are in these privileged positions to try to find a way forward. But at the core of it is the protection and conservation of the spawning stock, of the zones in which that happens, so that we are in a position to provide that certainty to the industry for generational renewal, for investment, for the decarbonisation of the fleet and all that goes with it. So whilst maybe 7 or 8, 10 years ago, there was perhaps a necessity to be more rigorous or vigorous in terms of outlining the importance of conservation, it's now clear that it's staring the industry in the face. And I think those that may have been laggards to some extent, certainly at European level, are now very clear of the challenge and the scale of the challenge that we face. And the only way to do that is to follow the appropriate level of designation, identification of those areas, and then the management plans. And to take your point about the bottom trawling, we can sometimes focus too much on one particular issue and lose the overall objective. Because if there's enough areas that are protected, where the important spawning species are, well then that provides a future. And then there are clearly areas that can sustain some level of bottom trawling. So it can't be, I don't think it has to be either or. That's just my view on it. It doesn't have to be either or. It's about what is it we're trying to protect, and how do you go about doing that in the best way?
Would you like to come in?
Yeah, no, on the point about legal certainty, and I think we can link it with the potential environment omnibus that you mentioned. The industry needs legal certainty, and the omnibuses, all this wave of revision of legislative proposal by this European Commission does exactly the contrary. It creates legal uncertainty. All that in the names of ensuring better competitivity of the EU's industry, when it's doomed to fail, actually. And about that, the environment omnibus, so we hope the nature restoration regulation won't be included, because it's also linked to the protection of the ocean in some way. And related to that, we of course don't want the common fishery policy to be revised. Mm-hmm. First of all, we don't have the time. Revising legislation takes time. The European Commission must adopt a proposal, it goes to the Parliament, the Council. Given the urgency of the situation, there is just no time. We definitely don't want another omnibus, because we know now what omnibuses are about, right? They are not about simplification. They are about dismantling the regulatory framework adopted under the European Green Deal, and potentially before, in the case of the environment omnibus. And so weakening environmental standards, weakening public health protection. Second, it's not only about time. We mustn't revise the common fishery policy because it's one of the most important tools we have at hand to ensure that we actually transition towards low-impact fisheries and more sustainable fisheries, and that we ensure as well the resilience of our coastal communities. We receive testimonies from fishers that tell us they cannot make a living anymore thanks to their economic activity. Mm-hmm. Some of them are on the verge of suicide, exactly because there's no fish to fish anymore. We haven't reached good environmental status under the Marine Strategic Framework Directive. We haven't reached a deadline under the Common Fishery Policy to end overfishing, and marine protected areas are only protected on paper. And so the ocean is not in a good health currently. And why do we need it to be in a good health, in addition of the fact that we want the ocean to be in a good health? It's because if the ocean is not in a good state, we cannot have a solid, healthy, thriving blue economy that we need.
I think we have a couple of questions for Commissioner Cadiz there. The first one, just going back to enforcing EU law, you hinted at the Ocean Act looking into how to better enforce EU ocean law. Would you be able to provide some indications of what the Commission is considering, how to better enforce that?
Well, it's very early to say, since we have not even started the consultation exercise for the Ocean Act. Very soon we will announce the call for evidence, and we will invite everyone to contribute. And yes, one of the dimensions of the Ocean Pact will be enforcement and how this legislation will be implemented on the ground. It will be one of the aspects that will be discussed during the consultation exercise.
Okay. And the call for evidence coming this month, is that right?
I think it's beginning of 2026.
Okay, it's more January.
Yeah.
And then picking up on Anaïs's point about the environmental omnibus, there have obviously been a lot of pushes to get the nature restoration regulation in there, which could have implications for ocean protections. Do you think it's a risk, including the nature restoration law in the environmental omnibus?
Simplification is carried out without missing the ambitious targets, environmental targets that we have set. So our focus is how we can achieve these targets, but in a more flexible and less bureaucratic way. Let me just mention that a few days ago, the assessment of the strategic guidelines for aquaculture development was published. And one of the main obstacles for the sustainable development of aquaculture in the European Union is licensing. It takes 6, 7, 8 years for an application to get the final license. And we need to make this procedure less bureaucratic and facilitate the aquaculture producers to increase the production. You know that we import 70% of our seafood needs from third countries. So we don't expect to cover this gap only from fisheries. We are approaching our limits. So if we want to close this gap, it's through aquaculture. When you need 7 years or 8 years to get the license for the operation of an aquaculture farm, this is a huge obstacle. So we are not losing sight of the ambitious targets that we have set. What we are trying to do is to reduce bureaucracy in achieving these targets.
And on nature restoration regulation in particular, can you give an indication of whether that's likely to be in the environmental omnibus?
this is under the competence of Commissioner Oswald. I don't think that it will be in the immediate priorities. However, I cannot speak on behalf of Commissioner Oswald. For our policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, I fully share the views that the Common Fisheries Policy has produced positive, tangible positive results. And we can see these results on the ground. Before its last revision in 2013, only 5 species were fished at sustainable levels in the Atlantic. Now, 60 species, 60 fish stocks, 60, are fished at sustainable levels. This is a huge improvement, which is based on the efforts that the sector made and the approach of the European Commission for a science-based decision-making. We will continue this approach. However, we needed to evaluate the Common Fisheries Policy 12 years after its revision to see if it's fit for today's condition, if we need to further improve it. It regulates the whole fisheries sector in the European Union. And in my missions to different member states, there are issues that are brought to my attention that I'm sure that they will be pointed out by this evaluation. Issues like the need for decarbonization and modernization of the fishing fleet, of generational renewal, of improving the working conditions, issues like regulating the recreational fisheries or promoting the small-scale fishers further. So all these topics, I'm sure that they will be pointed out by the evaluation. These are issues that were raised many times in the Council by the ministers, and we cannot have a blind eye on all of these topics. We have to address these challenges for the sector, and that's why we are carrying out the evaluation. And the evaluation will be completed next spring. For the first time, the results will be announced in an informal ministerial meeting that will take place in Cyprus in the framework of the Cyprus presidency of the European Council next May. And they will be officially discussed at the Council next June.
Okay. Yeah, if I could just maybe just add.
We haven't heard from Espen for a while yet, so I'd just like to bring Espen in on what we've just heard from the Commissioner.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you that it takes a very, very long time to change legislation in the EU. Way too long. The control regulation that was agreed last year took more than 5 years. What happens in those 5 years is that the technological advances sort of surpass the legislation at hand, and the same thing goes for the common fisheries policy. So if we don't change the common fisheries policy, we can't build green vessels. We can't build vessels that are driven by green technologies. It's simply in the legislation because it was designed in another time. All our vessels in the Danish pelagic fleet have cameras and fully documented fisheries right now. But still, the skipper needs to fill out paper forms, etc., etc., etc. Loads of paperwork that could be done with advanced technology. That's because the control regulation doesn't allow for this. So I don't really feel that there's a risk for the environment and so on for an omnibus or a change of the common fisheries policy. It's common sense that we need to move in tune with time, and the very, very slow legislative processes in the EU sometimes brings us to a point where the legislation we just approved is basically obsolete or way out of tune with time. In order for us to stay competitive, in order for us to develop the sector, become greener and more progressive, we need to have legislation that's on par with time and surroundings. So that's why we need an omnibus, and we need to have a closer look at the CFP, Common Fisheries Policy, to allow us to transition into green technologies, for example.
Okay. If we go to the Minister and then to Anna Yusuf.
Yeah, just in support of what the Commissioner is saying vis-à-vis the revision and the necessity for it, you rightly identified 13 years. But it's not just the passage of time, it's the significant changes that have taken place in between, and the Commissioner had an opportunity when he was in Ireland and elsewhere just to see the impact of climate change in that period of time, what it's having in relation to the migration of various stocks, where they're now spending most of their time, etc. And, you know, how do you manage the fishing effort there? And of course, you might expect me to say this because it impacted greatest on us from a fishing perspective, the impact of Brexit on the sector generally. Very significant in terms of the quota that, from an Irish perspective and others, lost in order for continued access to UK waters. And in addition to that, just the change in focus around the decarbonisation and the impact that that's having on fleet, on the owners of boats, and how we might want to support that. I mean, the MFAF funding that's there, the kind of conditions, the conditionality that's attached to that, I think our emphasis will have changed in the intervening period for the issues that I've identified. So in order to be able to support the sector, I think we'll have to look at all of that. So it's appropriate, and I understand, of course, in any revision, you've got to be careful what you wish for. There may be unintended consequences that you may ultimately have a challenge to deal with, but I think that's where we need to come from on that.
On the revision of the CFP, in the context we are today, we know that an omnibus means weakening environmental protection. It is just factual. If you look at all the omnibuses that have been adopted, no climate transition plans anymore in the CSDDD, reducing of the scope of the directive, reintroducing carcinogenic substances in cosmetic in the chemical omnibus, in the food and feed omnibus, reauthorizing pesticides without any need of renewal, not taking into consideration the latest science, and so on and so on. It is objectively weakening environmental and public health standards. So no, what we need is to invest in more implementation, better implementation and enforcement of the CFP, which I agree with Commissioner Cadiz has been delivering, more capacity and more funding. And on the funding, again, all of this needs to be underpinned by ring-fence funding for small-scale fishers and for conservation and restoration measures. Unfortunately, in the past, small-scale fishers were getting, I think, around only 20% of EU fisheries funds from the EU fund, when they actually represent a bit more than 70% of the EU fleet. Unfortunately, the Commission's proposal for the EU budget is completely neglecting small-scale fishers once again. So without more targeted support, this sector is just meant to disappear. So we have the opportunity once every 7 years, let's do it now. There is no money allocated in the Commission's proposal either for oceans protection, for marine issues. And so there, again, we need funding, and that goes against actually the recommendations of the European Court of Auditors that says really clearly that there is a need for additional funding, not only to protect marine areas, not only to restore certain marine ecosystems, but also to ensure pollution reduction and climate resilience. Because, of course, we won't address the climate crisis without protecting the ocean. Both are completely interconnected, and decarbonization won't be enough. We need to protect nature.
Okay. On that note, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. I wish we could keep talking about this. Thank you so much to you all for the super interesting exchange. I think we've learned a lot about the EU's approach to ocean governance and what to expect from the Ocean Act and areas for improvement. Please do stay seated. We're going to do a quick stage change now before our next session, The Chemistry of Success, Building a Competitive and Sustainable Sector, moderated by my colleague Jakob Weisman. But for now, please join me in giving a round of applause to our 4 speakers.